Hello again, everyone. So at the end of the last video, we finished the setup for the problem of patient autonomy this week. And we ended by discussing paternalism, right? And so our big issue is determining whether or not strong paternalism is ever justified. And so we're going to look at 4 different authors who tackle this question in some way or another. They're all evaluating whether or not strong paternalism can ever be morally justified. We're going to look at Gerald Dworkin, who believes we can justify strong paternalism in cases where overriding that person's will provides a wider range of freedom for the person. Another way of saying this might be that we can justify paternalistic actions when overriding that person's will furthers their autonomy, right? So it's paternalism for autonomy's sake. We get more autonomy when these paternalistic actions occur, and so it's justified. Goldman claims that, at least in medical contexts, our strong paternalism can never be justified because a doctor can't properly know a patient's preference ordering. So that goes back to what we were mentioning in the last video, the who knows best bit, right? It seems like you're the expert on you. A doctor could never have the relevant expertise about what your desires and interests and values are. And so Goldman takes that line very seriously. A patient is going to be better at that than a doctor is. A doctor will never have that relevant expertise, and so strong paternalism isn't justified. Paternalist actions will always get in the way of a patient's value ordering and harm them. Ackerman says that in medical contexts, strong paternalism can be justified because when we're ill, our autonomy is hampered, right? And so we are limited in our autonomy, our autonomous behavior. And so doctors have to do, it's required, doctors must do whatever they can to restore us to our full autonomy, right? So in order to respect us as autonomous beings, Ackerman claims it's not enough to just let us make a bunch of decisions while we're hampered by illness. Right? We have to actually, as doctors, try and restore the patient's autonomy. And so paternalism is going to be justified whenever it serves that end. And then finally, we'll have Schwartz, who's mainly worried about futility cases, but it extends to other cases as well. He's going to say strong paternalism is justified because the choice by patients for futile treatments is outside the proper scope of our autonomy. Okay, so let's start then by jumping into Gerald Dworkin's view. So Dworkin is going to start by evaluating an older philosopher's view. So the philosopher that he's working with is John Stuart Mill, who is the famous utilitarian you've already read earlier in the course when we were talking about ethical theory. Right, so one of Mill's famous positions is his anti-paternalism. Right, Mill thinks that paternalism, strong paternalism, can never be justified because the only time you can coerce somebody to do an action against their will is when it's to protect yourself or protect somebody else from harm. But we can never coerce somebody in order to protect them from themselves or advance their own interests. So here's Mill's idea summed up nicely. Mill claims that we're only justified in coercing someone to act or preventing them from acting as they wish in order to protect ourselves or others from harm. An individual's own good is never a sufficient warrant for the exercise of compulsion, either by society as a whole or its individual members. Right. So the rough idea here is we're only allowed to coerce somebody or prevent them from acting when they're going to cause harm to somebody else. Right? We can never prevent them from acting just because they're going to cause harm to themselves. Right? So Mill clearly has an anti-paternalist idea going on here. And the main sort of underlying idea for Mill against paternalism is we either cannot advance the interests of the individual by compulsion, or the attempt to do so involves an evil which outweighs the good done. Right. And so this is going to go back to our idea about who knows best. Right? So the idea is going to be paternalist actions cannot advance the interests of the individual because we don't know what's in their interests, right? They know better than we do what's in their interests. So we can't advance their well-being by compulsion, right? We're likely going to end up forcing them to do something that they don't want to do that is against their interests. Or the attempt to do so involves an evil which outweighs the good, right? Because we might save them from harm. We might actually advance their well-being, but we frustrate their autonomy, and that frustration of their autonomy is a great evil which outweighs the good we've done to their well-being. So Dworkin notes there's at least two specific types of arguments against paternalism that Mill gives. And the first is his utilitarian argument. And so from a utilitarian perspective, paternalist actions will fail to maximize utility for the same thing we've been saying, right? A person is the best judge of their own interests. So whenever we force a person to do what we think is in their best interests, we're more likely to make an incorrect judgment and so cause them to suffer. Right? Because people are the best judges of their own interests, if we try to force them to do what we think is best, we're probably going to end up making them suffer because we're going to make mistakes about what's in their interests. We don't have the expertise to do that correctly, or at least with as much efficiency and correctness as they themselves do. Now, Dworkin thinks, okay, this is fine, right? Sure, we're going to be worse at this than the individual themselves in most cases. But if we're a utilitarian, this can't be a universal principle against paternalist actions. Right? Remember, utilitarianism is highly, the actions it justifies is highly contingent matters. So torture could be justified in one case, ruled out in another case because it maximizes utility here, but doesn't maximize utility there. So the same thing's going to happen with paternalism, right? Our objection to paternalism can only be a contingent matter. It can't be a universal principle. Because although you're often the best judge of what's in your interests, that's surely not always the case. And we talked about some cases earlier where we think kids make mistakes. We as adults make mistakes in what's in our best interests when we smoke and drink too much or don't exercise, so on and so forth. Right? We make mistakes about that stuff. And so even though most of the time we're the better judge, surely we're not always the better judge. And so if we're going to remain truly utilitarian about this, paternalistic actions will sometimes maximize utility because the paternalist will know better than you, in at least some cases, what's better for you. And so paternalism would be justified then. So according to this utilitarian thread, right, paternalism is going to be justified sometimes, unjustified other times. So Mill doesn't have this outlaw universal principle for paternalism yet. However, Dworkin also notes that Mill has another line of anti-paternalist thinking in his writing. And here, Dworkin thinks Mill has sort of left utilitarianism behind and has a thread of non-utilitarian reasoning going on here. So Mill's going to claim that the value of autonomy, or this value to choose and self-determine, is a good that's independent of what is chosen. Right? So it's not because having autonomy allows us to choose other valuable things that makes autonomy valuable. No, it's just autonomy in itself. This ability to choose has its own value. And so paternalism is always going to be unjustified because it steps on this intrinsic value. Right? So we have this value that can't be sort of violated, right? So this doesn't seem utilitarian anymore. It seems more deontological, right? There's this right to autonomy, and even if it would maximize utility to violate our autonomy, we're not allowed. Right? So it seems like he's working with a non-utilitarian argument here. And if it's true, it seems to have some very strong anti-paternalist argument to it. However, Mill does believe that this value of autonomy can be limited. And so the classic case is that an individual cannot voluntarily enter into slavery because this would limit his ability to choose in the future, right? So Mill says, look, autonomy is important. It's important regardless of what we choose, right? It's just important that we get to choose. However, this means we can't become slaves because then we're self-imposing a limit on our future autonomy, right? When we become a slave, we no longer have that valuable ability to choose. So even though it seems like autonomy would allow us to choose to enter into slavery, that's ruled out because it harms our future autonomy. So although Mill had this sort of deontological value in place for autonomy, he does say it can be restricted in some senses. And so Dworkin's going to jump on this idea. He's going to say, once you allow this slavery restriction to autonomy, it opens the door for other paternalist actions. In other words, it opens the door for paternalist actions for autonomy's sake. So, according to Dworkin, here, paternalism is going to be justified just so long as it preserves a wider range of freedom for the person in question, right? So this provides us a more principled way of discussing it. It's justified to stop someone from entering into slavery because that preserves a wider range of freedom for them in the future. So that's why we need to think about this as paternalism for the sake of respecting autonomy. Whenever a paternalist action could secure a wider range of autonomy for the person than allowing them to do what they would do with their autonomy, we're allowed. Our paternalism is justified. So here, Dworkin is going to change it a little bit, but he's going to run with the same idea for the most part. He wants to take this Millian justification to its limit. So in order to do that, he wants to say, look, all we need to inspect is the idea of what hypothetical individuals would agree to if they were perfectly rational. Right? So what types of paternalist actions would these hypothetical individuals agree to? So the restriction of autonomy will be justified whenever that restriction would be agreed to by fully rational individuals for the sake of protecting their autonomy. So another way to apply this to the slavery case is to say, look, if you were fully rational, you would want slavery contracts to be illegal because that's going to protect yourself from entering into such a contract and frustrating your future autonomy. So the fully rational individual realizes how valuable autonomy is and so wants certain things just off the table. So this is going to give us a limited paternalism, right? There are at least now two such restrictions that all rational individuals would agree to. They'd say, look, you can restrict actions which produce irreversible changes or which make it difficult to return to the previous state. For example, you can make it illegal to take mind-altering drugs because those could destroy your rationality or at least diminish them. It could possibly allow restrictions to playing sports with high rates of concussion because those can produce irreversible changes to your rationality. It would also allow actions to be outlawed which are performed under extreme psychological or sociological pressure, so laws preventing suicide would be justified. However, Dworkin notes, rational individuals probably wouldn't agree to outright prohibitions of all of these things. Instead, the rational person would say, look, I need a waiting period. You can put a legal waiting period in place so that I have time to check the rationality of my decision. So in other words, your rational, ideally rational person would want insurance against themselves, right? They realize that we make a lot of mistakes when we're thinking in the real world. And so we need to take out an insurance policy against ourselves. So we could have paternalist means like that. So then for you, I'm going to leave this question, right? How does Dworkin's reasoning here extend to the medical case? When Can a doctor override the will of a patient in accordance with this principle? In other words, what types of medical paternalist actions would be justified by thinking about what all these ideally rational hypothetical people would agree to? What insurance policies do we need against ourselves in the medical field? And that's it. Thank you.